August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Japan. 8:15 in the morning. The city is already awake. Streetcars rattle along their tracks. Schoolchildren in cotton uniforms walk in loose clusters towards assembly points, many of them heading to clear firebreaks as a part of the war effort. A woman hangs washing on a line behind her home near the Aioi Bridge, the distinctive T-shaped crossing that sits almost exactly at the city's center. Above, at an altitude of roughly 9,400 meters, a lone American B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay has just released a single object from its bomb bay. It falls for 43 seconds. Nobody below reacts to the aircraft. Single planes have flown over Hiroshima before without incident, and the air raid sirens fell silent nearly an hour earlier. Then, at a height of about 580 meters above the city, the object detonates. What follows will end the deadliest conflict in human history and open an entirely new one, a cold and silent contest between nations that will shape the following 80 years. This is not simply the story of a bomb. It is the story of an idea that raced across continents and laboratories in the space of 6 desperate years, of a scientific gamble that consumed more money and manpower than any project before it, and of a single Tuesday morning that changed what it meant to fight a war at all. To understand what fell on Hiroshima, we first need to understand why so many of the era's greatest scientific minds became convinced that it had to be built before anyone else built it first. The story begins not with weapons, but with physics. In the 1930s, researchers across Europe were unpicking the structure of the atom itself. In December 1938, the German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working in Berlin, achieved something nobody had managed before. They split a uranium nucleus. Their former colleague, Lisa Meitner, by then a refugee from Nazi persecution living in Sweden, worked out the physics of what had happened and gave it a name still used today: nuclear fission. The implications were staggering. Splitting a single uranium atom released an amount of energy that, multiplied across billions upon billions of atoms in a chain reaction, could in theory produce an explosion of a scale never before achieved by human hands. The trouble was that this discovery happened inside Germany, a nation already rearming under Adolf Hitler and less than a year from invading Poland. Scientists who had fled Nazi Europe understood immediately what this might mean. Albert Einstein, at the urging of the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, wrote directly to President Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939, warning that Germany might be capable of building what he called extremely powerful bombs. For nearly 3 years, that warning sat largely unactioned, one memorandum among thousands crossing a president's desk. Britain moved faster. A 1940 assessment produced by refugee physicists Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, working at the University of Birmingham, calculated for the first time that a bomb using a few kilograms of a rare uranium isotope might be not just possible, but achievable within the time frame of the ongoing war. That single memorandum, smuggled through British intelligence channels, is widely credited with convincing skeptical officials on both sides of the Atlantic that the theory was no longer science fiction. What existed by 1941, then, was not a weapon, but a terrifying possibility, and an even more terrifying uncertainty. Nobody knew whether Germany's own physicists, several of them world-class, had reached the same conclusions. Nobody knew how far along a German program might already be. Intelligence on the matter was thin and often contradictory, filtered through neutral countries and the occasional defector, leaving Allied planners to assume the worst rather than risk assuming too little. Britain, exhausted by the Blitz and stretched thin across every theater of war, lacked the industrial capacity to build the vast infrastructure such a weapon would demand. Under the codename Tube Alloys, British scientists continued their research through 1941 and 1942, producing some of the earliest practical work anywhere on how such a device might be engineered. But by 1943 it had become clear that only the United States possessed the uninterrupted industrial base, the raw materials, and the manpower to turn theoretical physics into a deliverable weapon within the time frame the war demanded. That August, at a conference in Quebec, Britain and the United States agreed to merge their efforts, with British scientists traveling to America to join what had by then become a largely American-run program. There was a second, quieter dimension to the problem as well. Even setting the German question aside, nobody was certain the physics would translate into an actual weapon at all. A chain reaction that released energy gradually, as in a reactor, was one thing. Compressing that same reaction into a fraction of a second, reliably, inside a device small enough to be dropped from an aircraft, was an engineering challenge nobody on Earth had ever attempted. The raw material itself posed a further obstacle. Natural uranium contains less than 1% of the fissile isotope needed to sustain an explosive chain reaction, meaning usable quantities had to be separated from atoms that behaved almost identically, using industrial processes that barely existed at any meaningful scale in 1941. The problem, in short, was this. A rival power might already be building the most destructive weapon conceivable. The theoretical path to building one had just been proven sound on paper. Nobody had yet proven it could be built in practice, and the only realistic way to guarantee such a device did not fall into the wrong hands first was to solve every one of those problems faster than anyone else on Earth. The response to that problem became the largest scientific and industrial undertaking the world had yet seen. In 1942, the United States established what became known as the Manhattan Project, drawing together British and Canadian expertise, roughly 130,000 workers at its peak, and an eventual cost of around $2 billion, a figure equivalent to tens of billions today. Its scientific director was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a physicist from Berkeley whose gift lay less in any single discovery than in his extraordinary ability to hold together a team of brilliant and often fractious minds. Its military head was General Leslie Groves, an engineer who had just finished overseeing construction of the Pentagon, and who now had to build, essentially from nothing, 3 secret cities. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, an entire secret township sprang up almost overnight, its population swelling past 75,000 within a couple of years, to houseworkers operating enormous factories built to separate the rare, fissile isotope uranium-235 from the far more common uranium-238. The scale of the electrical demand alone was staggering. The Oak Ridge site is estimated to have consumed roughly 1/7 of all the electricity generated in the United States at the height of production, more power than entire American cities combined. Most of the workers employed there, many of them women recruited from the surrounding region, had no idea what they were actually building. They operated dials and monitored gauges inside vast buildings without ever being told the purpose of the material passing through the machinery around them. At Hanford, in the high desert of Washington State, an equally secret complex of nuclear reactors and chemical processing plants produced a newly discovered element, plutonium, as an alternative path to a bomb, drawing its cooling water from the Columbia River on a scale that reshaped the surrounding landscape. And at Los Alamos, a remote mesa in New Mexico chosen partly for its isolation and its existing boys' school buildings, Oppenheimer assembled a team of physicists, chemists, and engineers, many of them refugees from fascist Europe, whose task was to work out how to actually turn these exotic materials into a functioning weapon rather than simply a controlled reaction. 2 distinct designs emerged from that effort, reflecting the 2 different fissile materials the project had produced. The uranium weapon, eventually codenamed Little Boy, relied on a comparatively straightforward principle, propelling one piece of highly enriched uranium into another at speed so that their combined mass became capable of sustaining a runaway chain reaction. It weighed around 4,400 kilograms and measured roughly 3 meters in length, a squat, cylindrical shape that ground crews sometimes likened to an oversized dustbin fitted with tail fins. So confident were the scientists in the soundness of this particular approach that it was never fully tested before it was used in combat. The plutonium weapon, codenamed Fat Man, demanded a far more intricate solution, since plutonium could not be safely assembled using the same straightforward method. It instead required an arrangement of precisely shaped conventional explosive charges detonated in careful sequence around a spherical core, a method demanding such exacting engineering and split-second timing that, unlike its uranium counterpart, it absolutely had to be proven first. That proof came in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, in a test codenamed Trinity, which produced a fireball witnesses recalled as brighter than the desert sun, a shockwave felt many kilometers away, and confirmation, for the first time in human history, that the theory worked in practice as well as on paper. Oppenheimer himself later said the test brought to mind a line from Hindu scripture about becoming death, the destroyer of worlds, a reaction that captured the unease even its creators felt at what they had built. Manufacturing on this scale required an industrial supply chain almost as complex as the weapon itself. Components for both bombs were fabricated at multiple sites across the country before being brought together, under armed guard, at the forward air base on the Pacific island of Tinian, roughly 2,400 kilometers south of Japan, where final assembly took place inside specially constructed, heavily guarded huts in the weeks before the mission. Because so much of this material remained classified for decades afterwards, the precise production numbers, costs, and engineering tolerances involved were not fully declassified until long after the war, and some operational details of the bomb's internal design remain restricted to this day. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. By the summer of 1945, both weapons were ready, and the war in the Pacific had entered its grimmest phase. American planners, having endured brutal, costly island campaigns at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were drawing up invasion plans for the Japanese home islands that some estimates suggested could cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, alongside Japanese losses potentially running into the millions. Conventional bombing had already devastated Japan's cities. A single incendiary raid on Tokyo in March 1945 had killed perhaps 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bombing would kill outright. Against this backdrop, President Harry Truman, who had only learned of the bomb's existence after Roosevelt's death that April, authorized its use against a Japanese target. A short list of possible targets had been drawn up months earlier, with military planners deliberately favoring cities that had so far escaped serious conventional bombing. Precisely so, the effects of this untested weapon could be measured against a largely intact urban landscape, rather than one already reduced to rubble. Hiroshima topped that list for grimly practical reasons. It was a genuine military and industrial center, home to a regional army headquarters and significant war production, situated on flat terrain surrounded by hills that would help contain and amplify the blast. Kokura had originally been designated as the primary target for the second bombing 3 days later, and Nagasaki its secondary alternative. Only heavy cloud cover over Kokura on the morning of August 9th spared that city and sent the mission on to Nagasaki instead, a decision made in the air within minutes by the crew of the aircraft carrying Fat Man. The Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets and named for his mother, took off from Tinian in the early hours of August 6th, accompanied by 2 further aircraft carrying scientific instruments and photographic equipment, alongside separate weather reconnaissance planes sent ahead to each candidate target to report back on visibility. What happened when Little Boy detonated above Hiroshima has been documented since through thousands of survivor testimonies, known in Japan as hibakusha accounts, describing a blinding flash brighter than the sun, an instant and searing wave of heat that left shadow-like silhouettes burned onto stone where people and objects had stood, and a shock wave that flattened wooden buildings across a wide radius of the city center within seconds. Fires that broke out in the ruins soon merged into a firestorm that consumed still more of the city through the following hours. Estimates of the dead vary and always will, given the chaos of the aftermath and the deaths that continued for months and years afterwards from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. But historians generally place the toll by the end of 1945 somewhere between 90,000 and 140,000 people, in a city whose population had stood at roughly 350,000. A second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, killing a further estimated 60,000 to 80,000 people by the end of that year. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, formally signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, bringing the Second World War to its final close. It is worth pausing here on what other nations attempted, because the comparison reveals just how narrow the margin between success and failure really was. Germany's own nuclear research, led in part by the physicist Werner Heisenberg, never came close to a working weapon. German efforts were hampered by resource constraints, scientific miscalculation, wartime disruption, and, crucially, the loss of their heavy water supply from a plant at Vemork in occupied Norway, repeatedly sabotaged by Norwegian resistance fighters trained by Britain's Special Operations Executive. By the war's end, German researchers remained years behind their American counterparts, still debating basic questions the Manhattan Project had resolved long before, and when a group of leading German physicists, Heisenberg among them, were secretly recorded discussing the news of Hiroshima while interned by the Allies at an English country house, their taped reactions revealed genuine shock at how far their own program had lagged. Britain, for its part, having merged its wartime effort into the American project, found itself largely shut out of the resulting technology once the war ended, and was forced to develop its own independent weapon from scratch through the following decade, finally testing it in 1952. The Soviet Union, by contrast, caught up remarkably quickly, aided substantially by espionage, most notably the physicist Klaus Fuchs, who had worked at Los Alamos itself, and passed detailed information to Moscow throughout the war. The Soviets tested their first weapon in 1949, a gap of just 4 years, far shorter than American officials had confidently predicted, and one that transformed the entire strategic picture of the emerging Cold War almost overnight. What the Manhattan Project achieved, in essence, was not simply a technical breakthrough but a temporary and ultimately fleeting monopoly, one measured not in decades but in a handful of years. The legacy of that August morning is difficult to compress into a single verdict, and honest history should not try. Materially, the bombings caused destruction on a scale that dwarfed even the firebombing campaigns that preceded them, leveling city centers in seconds rather than hours. Psychologically, their impact went further still, introducing into global politics an entirely new category of dread, the knowledge that a single weapon, delivered by a single aircraft, could erase a city in an instant. Historians continue to debate how decisive the bombings actually were in ending the war, weighing them against the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan just 2 days after Hiroshima, against the ongoing conventional devastation of Japanese cities, and against a Japanese leadership already divided over the terms of surrender. What is not seriously disputed is the shadow the events cast forward across the following decades. They inaugurated the nuclear age, an era defined for more than 4 decades by the Cold War doctrine of mutually assured destruction, in which the world's 2 superpowers built arsenals eventually numbering in the tens of thousands of warheads, weapons many times more powerful than Little Boy, precisely because both sides understood exactly what such devices could do to the other. That same era also produced a slow, halting effort to contain the technology it had unleashed, from the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, agreements built directly on the memory of what had happened over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, remnants of that morning can still be seen in Hiroshima itself, most strikingly at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the skeletal ruin of a building that stood almost directly beneath the blast and was deliberately preserved, rubble and twisted steel frame intact as a permanent and deliberately unrestored witness to what took place there. Return for a moment to that Tuesday morning, to the streetcars still running their routes, to the children walking to their assembly points, to the woman hanging washing behind her home, going about the most ordinary task imaginable in the last ordinary moment her city would ever know. None of them could have understood what 6 years of theoretical physics, industrial mobilization, and desperate wartime calculation had produced above their heads. They could not have known that a discovery made in a Berlin laboratory in 1938, a warning letter written by history's most famous scientist, a British memorandum smuggled across the Atlantic, and the labor of well over 100,000 people across 3 secret American cities had all converged in that instant on their city alone. What began as a race against an uncertain rival ended not with the weapon that was feared, but with the weapon that was built. It proved in the space of a single flash that the theoretical had become real, that the laboratory had become the battlefield, and that humanity now possessed the means to end itself in an afternoon. Little Boy was 3 meters long. Its effects have lasted 80 years and counting. It was built to end one war. It began another, colder and quieter, that has never fully ended since. That is the story behind the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. Not one story, but many, converging on a single Tuesday morning and never truly finished since.